The name they would not give him. On authorship, diminishment, and the modern ritual of accountability without power. By Elias Winter, March 31st, 2026. Read by an automated voice. 1. The work he carried had no name. There is a particular humiliation that belongs to modern institutions, and because it is bloodless, because it leaves no mark on the skin, because no one raises a hand or voice, it is rarely called by its proper name. A man is given work of consequence. He is trusted with systems that touch revenue, product, operations, timing, risk, sequencing, and the difficult marriage between technical truth and institutional need. He is expected to see the whole, to anticipate trade-offs before others notice them, to integrate what the org itself has split apart, to carry contradictions without dropping delivery. When things go wrong, he is expected to understand why. When they stall, he is expected to explain how. When priorities collide, he is expected to absorb the collision and move the machine forward anyway. And yet when others speak of what he does, they use smaller words. They call the system a model. They call leadership execution. They call architecture support. They call the integrator a specialist. They call the burden he carries by one fragment of its weight. This is not harmless shorthand. It is one of the oldest political acts in human life. To depend on a thing while refusing to name it correctly. To benefit from a person's breadth while narrating him in narrower terms. To let responsibility settle on his shoulders while authorship drifts upward, outward, or elsewhere. This is how someone can become central to an institution and still feel strangely absent from it. Not excluded exactly. That would at least be clear. Institutions prefer cleaner methods. They have learned that you do not need to expel a person to diminish him. You only need to keep using a name for him that is smaller than the role he is actually performing. At first, this seems survivable. The work is real. The trust is real. The meetings are real. The dependence is real. He is brought into strategy, drawn into ambiguity, asked to synthesize what others cannot. But slowly a split appears between the reality of his labor and the story being told around it. On paper, he is broad. In practice, he is broad. In burden, he is broad. But in the speech of others, he becomes thin. And there is a violence in this thinning. Not because the ego is wounded. That is how shallow people describe it. Not because he wants praise. Praise is cheap, and institutions hand it out precisely when they want to avoid the more costly act of public clarity. The wound is deeper than vanity. It comes from the knowledge that names are not decorative. In any human system, the name assigned to a thing determines how others are permitted to relate to it. The name is the first architecture of power. Call a man an executor, and others will root direction around him. Call him technical, and product will treat him as downstream. Call the work a model, and the rest of the strategy disappears from view. Call him support, and accountability remains, while authorship migrates elsewhere. What is stolen first is not title, or compensation, or immediate security. What is stolen first is legibility. The org ceases to see where leadership actually sits, and once that sight is lost, a slower theft begins. The cruel genius of the process is that it often occurs under conditions of apparent trust. He is included. He is relied upon. He is even praised, in fragments. Nothing overtly hostile need happen. The institution can say, with sincerity, that it values him. And it may. But value without proper naming is one of the preferred hypocrisies of our age. It allows systems to consume a person's integrative power without conceding what that power would imply if publicly acknowledged. For if they named him rightly, much else would have to change. Decision rights would have to become cleaner. Routing would have to become more honest. Representation would have to follow substance. Sponsors would have to sponsor, not merely benefit. Executives would have to stop speaking as though complexity belonged to them by birthright and to others by delegation. That is where this essay begins. Not with grievance, but with recognition. A man carries work larger than the names being used for it. The organization relies on his full range while speaking of him in part. He feels in his body the collision between actual accountability and symbolic diminishment. He begins to understand that what is happening is not confusion, but compression. And once you see compression, you begin to see how much of modern professional life is built on it. 2. The violence of the smaller frame. There are lies that arrive as declarations, and there are lies that arrive as simplifications. The first kind is easy to recognize. It has enemies, slogans, force. It wants to win openly. The second kind is more elegant. It enters the room wearing the clothes of practicality. It says, "We are just trying to keep it simple." It says, "Give me the headline." It says, "What is the latest on the model?" This second kind of lie is more dangerous because intelligent people often tolerate it. They tell themselves that no real harm is being done. We are moving fast. We need shorthand. We need something executive-shaped. We cannot preserve every distinction. But every shorthand has a politics. To reduce a complex strategic initiative to the model is not merely to save syllables. It is to alter the perceived center of gravity of the work. It is to imply that the main action lives in modeling, that the strategic problem is chiefly a technical artifact, that the person leading it is therefore best understood through that narrower frame. Execution fades. Program design fades. Experimentation fades. Sequencing fades. Cross-functional architecture fades. What remains is a flatter, more manageable object that can be discussed by people who do not wish to update themselves at the speed of the actual work. That is why false framing feels so exhausting. The fatigue is not just from having to explain. It is from having to begin every explanation by resurrecting the world the other person's category has already killed. Before you can discuss timing, you must repair the object. Before you can discuss progress, you must repair the map. Before you can discuss responsibility, you must repair the category through which responsibility is being seen. A badly framed question can therefore feel aggressive even when spoken casually. It is not only asking for information, it is demanding that reality pass through a distorted opening and still emerge intact on the other side. Most people do not notice this. They move through institutional life with enough conceptual looseness that category errors feel harmless. If the work has changed, they assume the label can stay for convenience. If a person's role is broader than what they call him, they imagine no serious injury has occurred. But there are minds for whom structure matters more than social smoothing. Minds that do not experience category errors as trivial. Minds that feel, almost physically, the abrasion of being asked to cooperate with a false frame. Such minds are often called intense, and they are. But what is called intensity is sometimes only fidelity. Fidelity to structure. Fidelity to reality. Fidelity to the proposition that a system already carries enough confusion without the deliberate maintenance of inaccurate language by those who benefit from the resulting blur. The smaller frame is rarely neutral. It serves someone. It serves the executive who wants a neat dashboard of a messy strategic reality. It serves the sponsor who wants the work done, but not necessarily the authorship redistributed. It serves the organization that prefers functions to remain fuzzy, where political flexibility is useful. It serves those who speak over the work more than they inhabit it. This is why correction alone is often insufficient. You can explain, calmly and accurately, that the active levers are execution and program design, that modeling is one component among several, that the broader initiative spans architecture, prioritization, and experimentation. You can do all of this faithfully, but if the institution is invested in the smaller frame, your correction will not land simply as information. It will land as resistance to a convenience from which others derive political comfort. They are not only misunderstanding you, they are using a version of reality that costs them less. And once that simplification becomes normal speech, it does more than irritate. It reorganizes the social field around the lie. People rout around the role because the language around the role has already prepared them to do so. Stakeholders use stale handles. Product leads step in. Sponsors remain ambiguously central. The organization starts inferring the real org chart from repeated shorthand rather than from formal structure or actual labor. That is how a smaller frame becomes a larger wound. It is not just a sentence, it is a mechanism. 3. To be used in full and seen in part. Every decaying institution eventually perfects a certain art, the art of extracting full-spectrum labor from a person while granting him only partial symbolic reality. The modern version of exploitation is subtle. It gives you latitude. It trusts you with meaningful problems. It brings you into rooms where consequential things are discussed. It calls you strategic. It says you are valuable. Sometimes all of this is true, and yet the institution still withholds something essential. It withholds the public coherence that would align the story of your role with the reality of your labor. So you become a strange kind of figure, used in full, seen in part. You carry the whole, but people speak to one piece of you. You are accountable for the system, but others relate to you as a component. You integrate product, architecture, execution, design, sequencing, and risk. But the org engages you through whatever slice is easiest to name. This creates a deep asymmetry between the burden of reality and the surface through which reality is socially recognized. If you are seen only in part, you must constantly do two jobs instead of one. First, you must actually lead the work. Second, you must continually compensate for the fact that others are interacting with a diminished rendering of the role through which that work is being led. In practice, this means you are always translating upward, sideways, and downward. You restore scope to conversations that have been narrowed. You absorb the confusion produced by blurred interfaces. You repair the map while trying to walk the terrain. This is the hidden tax placed on integrative people in fragmented systems. They are required not only to think holistically, but to defend the existence of the whole against those who prefer interacting with fragments. And because they can hold contradictions longer than others, the system relies on them even more. They can see across organizational boundaries. They can anticipate second-order effects. They can translate between technical, product, operational, and executive languages. They can absorb imprecision and still return with structure. So the institution experiences them as dependable. It seldom experiences them as burdened. That is why being trusted can become misleading. Trust on substance is not the same as clarity of authorship. A person may be trusted to solve what others cannot solve while still not being publicly stabilized as a locus of authority. He becomes indispensable in process and optional in representation. That split is corrosive. It allows others to draw on his full range when burden must be carried, while reverting to narrower frames when credit, narrative, or legibility are at stake. He is broad when things are hard, and narrow when things are being narrated. This is not an accident. Partial visibility is useful. It allows the institution to have the benefit of broad leadership without paying the full political price of acknowledging where leadership actually resides. To see a person fully would require reordering certain habits. Who is brought in early? Who is treated as primary? Who gets represented upward? Whose framing becomes default? Partial sight preserves flexibility for those above and around him. That is why the arrangement can continue for so long without open conflict. Everyone can plausibly deny that anything unjust is happening. The person has influence. The person has access. The person is involved. The person is valued. What more does he want? The question is revealing. It assumes that symbolic coherence is vanity rather than operating reality. It assumes that public authorship is ornamental rather than causal. It assumes that a role can be functionally broad while socially narrow without downstream consequence. This is false. People follow signals, not org charts. They route based on repeated behavior, not formal documentation. They infer ownership from who frames, who gets copied, who speaks first, who appears central when decisions are being socially stabilized. If the person doing the real integration is only intermittently visible as the one who owns that integration, the field will reorganize around easier interpretations. Others will fill the vacuum, some upward, some sideways, some innocently, some opportunistically. Soon the person who holds the burden begins to look like one contributor among many to the very system he is actually carrying. That is the arrangement this essay refuses to sentimentalize. To be used in full and seen in part is not noble. It is not merely the cost of being cross-functional. It is often the symptom of a deeper disorder in which institutions consume integrative labor while keeping its human source politically underdefined. And when that underdefinition persists, it does something dangerous to the soul. It teaches a person that his fullest capacities will be most welcomed precisely where they are least likely to be properly named. It conditions him to live as infrastructure for other people's clarity. That is not maturity. It is a refined form of erasure. 4. Sponsorship without witness. There is a form of protection common in institutions that feels, at first, like safety. A senior leader trusts your judgment. He gives you room. He lets you lead discussions. He brings you into important matters. He does not humiliate you. He may sincerely admire your substance. If you are thoughtful, you notice that this is not nothing. Many people do not even receive that much. And yet, something essential remains missing. The sponsor trusts, but does not consistently testify. He relies, but does not always publicly stabilize. He benefits from your competence, but does not always make your authorship legible to others. He stands near the work, sometimes too near, in ways that blur rather than clarify where ownership properly sits. This is sponsorship without witness. The witness is the expensive part. It is not enough for someone above you to know privately that you are carrying the thing. He must make that truth visible in the social bloodstream of the organization. He must name it when others are forming impressions. He must root through it when ambiguity invites drift. He must behave in such a way that the broader field can infer, without confusion, where leadership actually resides. Without witness, sponsorship remains private sentiment. Private sentiment is too weak a currency to defend a role against organizational blur. This is especially true in functions that are newly strategic, politically fluid, or cross-functional by nature. The moment a domain becomes important enough to attract product attention, executive interest, or commercial scrutiny, informal trust is no longer sufficient. The work becomes a magnet for interpretation. people begin moving toward it from different angles. Product wants to shape. Engineering wants to root. Executives want visibility. Stakeholders want handles. The org begins to infer authority not from the architecture of responsibility, but from whoever is most visible in the field. At that point, the sponsor has a choice. He can remain merely involved, or he can actively clarify the operating model so that involvement does not become usurpation by drift. If he does the first and not the second, his proximity becomes politically ambiguous. Others follow the stronger signal, not because they are malicious, but because organizations are adaptive creatures. They move toward power, visibility, and convenience. This does not require betrayal. That is what makes it so difficult to diagnose. There is no neat villainy here. The incomplete sponsor may genuinely think he is empowering you. He may enjoy being close to every strategic thing without noticing the authorial leakage created by that closeness. He may sincerely believe that because he respects you privately, the organization will naturally understand your role publicly. It will not. Organizations do not reliably infer hidden respect. They infer structure from visible behavior. That is why incomplete sponsorship is so costly. It leaves the burdened person trapped between gratitude and alarm. Gratitude, because the sponsor is not hostile. Alarm, because the absence of public clarity keeps producing the same downstream distortions. Gratitude makes confrontation feel excessive. Alarm makes silence feel dangerous. But the problem is real. Not because the sponsor is evil, not because every ambiguity is an attack, but because unclarified authority does not remain neutral for long. It attracts redistribution. Product leaders begin to treat the sponsor as the real upstream. Executives direct traffic through him by habit. Engineers read his engagement as the ultimate prioritization signal. Stakeholders experience the work as living under his umbrella rather than under the functional leader's authority. Witness is expensive because it commits the witness himself. To publicly name where ownership lives is to limit one's own flexibility. It is to stop benefiting from productive ambiguity. It is to refuse the ambient centrality that senior leaders can enjoy when all important things remain slightly attached to them. Many leaders do not do this consistently, not because they lack decency, but because ambiguity is comfortable to those whose power is not threatened by it. The cost of blur is borne elsewhere. Thus, the burden falls back on the person below. He must narrate himself more actively than should be necessary. He must say what he owns before the room invents something smaller. He must distinguish sponsorship from authorship without sounding fragile. He must ask for cleaner interfaces without sounding territorial. This is among the least glamorous forms of leadership, to insist, gently and repeatedly, that the social field tell the truth about where the work actually lives. Without that insistence, trust remains too private to defend reality. 5. The burden of the translator. Some people move through institutions as specialists. Their task is bounded. Their burden is clear. There is honor in this. But there is another type of person on whom modern institutions depend more than they know how to admit. He is not simply a specialist, though he may possess specialist depth. He is a translator of worlds. He translates between product urgency and technical sequencing, between executive appetite and operational reality, between strategic narrative and implementation constraint, between what the organization says it values and how it behaves under pressure. He is the one to whom contradictions are handed because others do not know where else to put them. The room senses, often correctly, that he can hold more than one language at once. So it gives him the unresolved remainder. At first, this can feel like leadership. and it is leadership. But when the organization lacks clear interfaces, disciplined naming, and good sponsorship, the translator's role becomes pathological. He ceases to be a bridge between healthy functions and becomes instead the living patch for broken institutional design. He holds together what should have been better ordered in the architecture itself. This is where the burden turns from meaningful to punishing, because the translator never gets to remain inside one simple frame. Every conversation carries excess. Every update requires judgment about audience, language, timing, political signal, and conceptual accuracy. He must decide what to preserve, what to compress, what to challenge, what to leave for later, what false premise can be tolerated for one meeting, and which one must be corrected now before it metastasizes. Others experience this as fluency. He experiences it as load, and the load is heavier because the translator is usually the first to feel conceptual distortion as danger. When the work is framed wrongly, he knows not only that the sentence is inaccurate, but what downstream errors the sentence will produce if allowed to stand. He can see the cascade. He can feel the future confusion already latent in the present shorthand. That is why translators are often mistaken for being unusually sensitive or controlling. People who inhabit only one side of a system cannot feel the cost of mistranslation as quickly as the one who inhabits several. They hear a simplification. He hears the organizational future that simplification is about to manufacture. The burden deepens further when the translator is not fully recognized as such. Then he is not only translating, he is translating while some of the worlds he is translating between still imagine him as belonging chiefly to one side. Product sees him as technical. Technical sees him as strategic. Executives see him as functional. Each audience recognizes one legitimate fragment and misses the integrative whole that makes the translating possible. So he becomes, again, used broadly and seen narrowly. There is a temptation to romanticize this role. The one who sees across boundaries. The one who absorbs contradiction for the sake of the system. There is some nobility in it. But there is also danger. When the organization realizes that one person can metabolize its fragmentation, it may stop feeling urgency about repairing the fragmentation itself. The translator becomes a human subsidy for bad design. That is unsustainable. He must therefore do two things at once. Translate enough to keep the system moving, and push for enough structural clarity that the need for constant translation diminishes over time. He must not merely carry the brokenness elegantly. He must try, where possible, to reduce the amount of brokenness that requires elegant carrying. This is difficult because translation is rewarded faster than repair. The meeting gets saved. The update gets clarified. The stakeholder gets calmed. The launch keeps moving. Structural repair is slower and less dramatic. It requires naming ownership, tightening interfaces, clarifying operating models before confusion becomes crisis. Institutions addicted to urgency often prefer the translator's heroism to the builder's discipline. But a mature translator eventually learns that heroism is too expensive. He begins to refuse the seduction of being endlessly impressive under chaos. He would rather become less necessary by helping the system tell the truth about itself. Until then, he remains where so many serious people find themselves, at the crossing point of languages, preserving reality one sentence at a time, while trying not to confuse that burden with his identity. 6. Why the soul reacts so violently. There are moments in professional life when the scale of one's reaction seems, even to oneself, excessive. A colleague sends a message. A stakeholder uses the wrong phrase. A public question arrives with stale framing. The body floods as if something much larger were happening. One part of the mind knows that no immediate catastrophe has occurred, no one has fired you, no decree has been issued. And yet another part of the self responds as though a shelter has been threatened. Outsiders call this overreaction because they see only the trigger and not the meaning field into which the trigger has landed. The soul reacts violently when the immediate event strikes an older fault line. In such cases, the fault line is not merely professional pride. It is the fear of instability after instability. It is the knowledge of what the work represents beyond salary, routine, dignity, coherence, social rhythm, a usable morning, a structure in which one's capacities can be applied rather than rotting in private. When such a structure has been hard won, it becomes more than employment. It becomes habitat. That is why certain interactions do not land as annoyance. They land as threat signals against habitat. The mind hears the reductive stakeholder, the stale frame, the public narrowing, and instantly travels further. If they do not understand my role, how stable is my standing? If I am being compressed, does the place I rely on really know what it has? If sponsorship is incomplete and framing is stale, how solid is the ground beneath me? By the time the conscious mind catches up, the body has already taken the journey. This does not mean the body is irrational. It means the body is fast. It protects first and interprets later. There is another layer. Some minds have a low tolerance for conceptual violation. They do not experience repeated false framing as trivial. They experience it as a kind of moral abrasion. Language for them is not cosmetic. To use the wrong category for a thing is not just inaccurate. It is to flatten reality into a form convenient for power, laziness, or speed. When this happens repeatedly around work, one knows intimately, it feels like being asked to collaborate in a lie. That is why the reaction carries not only fear, but disgust. A person can bear under-recognition more easily than forced falsification. The former hurts. The latter corrodes. Under-recognition says, you are not fully appreciated. Forced falsification says, live inside a public description you know to be false so the institution can function more comfortably. For someone built around structure and fidelity to what is actually there, that demand becomes nearly intolerable. And yet another danger appears here. Because the reaction is so strong, the person may begin to absolutize the trigger. He turns one stakeholder into the whole institution. He takes a real pattern of diminishment and inflates it into a prophecy of total ruin. The nervous system prefers coherent dread to unstable ambiguity. It would rather name a monster than live inside mist. This inflation is understandable. It is also costly. The soul must therefore learn two difficult truths at once. First, that the wound is real. Second, that the scale of the wound is not always the scale initially felt in the body. To deny the wound is self-betrayal. To universalize it is self-destruction. One must become able to say, yes, this pattern is diminishing. No, it does not therefore control the entirety of my fate. This distinction is a form of inner government. Without it, every bad interaction becomes apocalyptic. With it, one can preserve perception without surrendering sovereignty. One can say, this stakeholder is reductive, but not omnipotent. This sponsor is incomplete, but not necessarily hostile. This pattern is dangerous, but not necessarily terminal. The body reacts because something sacred is involved. Truth, structure, habitat, dignity. The mind must then return and say, yes, sacred. No, not lost. Only then can the soul remain both awake and unenslaved. 7. the empire of shorthand. The office is never only the office. Every local pattern, if examined long enough, begins to reveal the larger civilization from which it emerged. A company is not a nation, and a Slack thread is not an empire. But the habits of a civilization reproduce themselves in miniature inside the organizations it builds. The same moral grammar appears at different scales. What a nation does to memory, a company often does to authorship. What an empire does to complexity, a bureaucracy often does to human roles. That is why this essay cannot remain only about titles, product meetings, or stale executive framing. The pattern underneath them is older and wider. It belongs to a world that can no longer metabolize depth without translating it into shorthand. A world that consumes complexity but cannot bear to publicly organize itself around those who actually carry complexity. A world of late systems. Late systems prefer surfaces. They need them. They are too sprawling, too accelerated, too politically delicate to constantly tell the full truth about where labor, insight, and integration actually reside. So they evolve a language of managerial approximation, handles, buckets, executive summaries, work streams, themes. None of these terms is inherently false, but in late systems, they become cover for a deeper exhaustion. Institutions want outcomes without the full moral and structural obligations that truthful naming would impose. This is the empire of shorthand. Its first principle is that reality must become portable. Any object too complex to travel quickly across status layers will be forcibly compressed until it can. The cost of compression is then paid downstream by those closest to the real structure. They must preserve what the summary has omitted. They must answer as if the flattened version were still connected to the whole. Its second principle is that authority clings to legibility, not always to truth. The person who can offer a simpler story often outranks the person who holds the more accurate one. This does not mean the simpler story wins forever. Reality eventually collects its debt. But in the medium run, institutions reward those who can make the world discussable at executive resolution, even when that resolution falsifies the object. The simplifier ascends, the integrator repairs. Its third principle is that authorship drifts upward while accountability settles downward. This is not always designed. Often it is the emergent property of a system in which visibility, naming, and sponsorship are distributed according to seniority and convenience rather than substantive burden. The result is a common absurdity. The one most responsible for coherence is often not the one most coherently represented. Anyone who has studied empires should recognize the pattern. Empires consume peripheries without understanding them. They rename what they take. They simplify what they cannot metabolize. They rely on intermediaries and translators, then deny those intermediaries full sovereignty. The modern corporation, stripped of banners and cavalry, has inherited much of this logic. It does not annex provinces. It annexes complexity. It says AI, data, experimentation, personalization, platform, efficiency, growth. Then it tries to govern these expanding territories through meeting cadences, simplified narratives, and power-adjacent shorthand. The result is predictable. Whole domains are discussed through fragments. Hybrid leaders are compressed into legible subsets. The center continues to speak with confidence, while the edges continue to absorb the burden of keeping reality from disintegrating. This is not merely a managerial flaw. It is a civilizational symptom. A culture addicted to velocity begins to treat compression as intelligence. A culture formed by dashboards, alerts, feeds, and executive urgency loses patience with the slower disciplines of exact naming and clean operating models. In such a culture, shorthand is moralized. To insist on distinctions is to risk seeming precious, slow, academic, difficult. The habits required to prevent false simplification are recoded as inefficiencies. That recoding is one of the signatures of decline, not because brevity is bad, but because a declining civilization increasingly cannot tell the difference between disciplined compression and falsifying reduction. It calls both strategy. It calls both leadership. It loses the capacity to honor those who keep complexity truthful without becoming unusably ornate. This is why the local injury belongs to a larger story. The man being compressed at work is not merely dealing with a few imperfect colleagues. He is living inside a broader culture that has normalized the consumption of depth through labels too small for what they contain. He is colliding with a pattern native to the age. This recognition is clarifying. It allows him to stop personalizing every reductive interaction as though it emerged uniquely from his own defects. No, he is facing a late imperial habit, to call a thing by the most manageable version of itself so that the center can continue moving without too much update. One cannot end the empire of shorthand single-handedly, but one can refuse to worship it. One can refuse to let its reductions become one's own internal language. One can insist, in the local sphere where one has responsibility, that naming track reality as closely as possible. One can build operating models that reduce the need for mystical interpretation. One can develop a style of correction that is brief but unyielding. Civilizations are not resisted only by revolutions. Sometimes they are resisted by exact sentences spoken at the right moment by people who have not yet surrendered their reverence for the real. The office is where much of modern life now hides its moral drama. The empire has gone managerial. Its conquests are linguistic, symbolic, procedural. It steals scale from persons and replaces it with role-compressed handles. It displaces truth with discussability. It rewards those who can move abstraction quickly and burdens those who must preserve the concrete beneath it. To notice this is not paranoia, it is literacy. And literacy in late empires is already a form of dissent. 8. The difference between power and permission. One of the more humiliating discoveries in professional life is that real responsibility can exist in the absence of fully granted permission. A person may be doing the work that makes a function coherent. He may be the one seeing the dependencies, sequencing the tradeoffs, absorbing the contradictions, holding the interfaces together, and bearing the practical accountability when things fail. In any substantive sense, power is already operating through him. Not ceremonial power, not always title-proportional power, but consequential power, the kind that shapes what actually happens. And yet the institution may not have fully conceded this. It may still behave, in moments that matter, as though permission lives elsewhere. The person can lead, but only ambiguously. He can decide, but others still step around the perimeter and behave as though the deeper source of sanction lies above, beside, or beyond him. He becomes responsible in practice and provisional in symbol. This is the difference between power and permission. Power is what the work itself requires of you. Permission is what the institution publicly allows others to recognize in you. When these align, leadership feels clean. The person carrying the burden is also socially legible as the person through whom the burden is rightly routed. Others know where to go. Sponsors reinforce. Interfaces stabilize. Role and representation converge. When they do not align, the person has enough power to be held accountable and not enough permission to be left unblurred. He must keep proving, in real time, that the leadership he is already exercising has the right to exist. This is exhausting because it creates a constant low-grade state of self-authorization. He enters a room already carrying the whole, yet must still subtly establish that he is entitled to speak from the scale of the whole. He makes a decision on behalf of the system, yet must still monitor whether others experience that decision as properly his to make. He narrates strategy, yet can feel the room quietly checking whether this narration is really his lane. Few people name this because permission is one of the most mystical currencies in institutions. It is rarely documented. No one writes, "You may be accountable, but not fully authorized in the public imagination." Permission is conveyed through witness, routing behavior, titles, who speaks first, who is copied, who is deferred to, who is introduced as owning the thing rather than contributing to it. Many high-capacity people remain trapped here longer than they should. They think the problem is that they need to do better work. Often, they are already doing the work. What is missing is not competence, but public sanction. Not the ability to carry, but the organization's willingness to let that carried reality become stable social truth. This is especially acute for hybrid leaders. Specialists often receive permission more easily because their boundaries are narrow and culturally legible. But the person whose role spans AI, data, experimentation, execution architecture, and cross-functional integration inhabits a more ambiguous territory. He sits at the seams of categories the institution still thinks of as partly separate. This makes him valuable and vulnerable at once. Thus he has power, but permission lags behind. The danger is that he begins asking permission from precisely those who are already benefiting from his unratified power. He starts phrasing ownership as preference instead of fact. He asks whether he may be included in matters for which he is already accountable. He softens role boundaries into requests for collaboration. He mistakes the institution's symbolic hesitation for evidence that he does not truly hold what he is already holding. This is spiritually damaging. It teaches a person to doubt the reality of his own burden. The mature path is harder. It requires claiming the reality of one's substantive power without theatrically demanding permission from every room. It requires acting from ownership, where ownership is already embedded in accountability, while pushing for the external conditions that make such ownership more legible and less personally expensive to maintain. To say, "I own this," when you bear the consequences of it, is not vanity. To expect routing to match accountability is not ego. To want sponsorship to clarify what is already substantively true is not fragility. It is simply a demand that reality stop splitting itself between burden and recognition. 9. Calm non-acquiescence. There comes a point in any serious life when one must choose a style of refusal. Not every distortion deserves war. Not every bad frame deserves a lecture. Not every reductive stakeholder deserves the full force of one's intelligence, and yet submission is intolerable. To nod along with the false category, to answer smoothly inside a misnaming that shrinks the work and the self, is to participate in one's own diminishment. What remains is a form of refusal that does not beg, does not rant, does not flatter, does not explain itself into depletion. A refusal that preserves reality without making a spectacle of its preservation. A refusal that does not surrender one's nervous system to every stale label delivered by someone with ambient authority. Call this calm non-acquiescence. Its first principle is simple. Do not grant the false frame more legitimacy than necessary. If someone asks a question using a category that is now wrong, do not answer as though the category were acceptable and then quietly smuggle the truth inside it. Correct the frame briefly. Name the active levers. Restore the actual object. Then proceed or stop, depending on what the moment requires. This matters because every unanswered false premise becomes a tiny constitutional amendment in the social life of the organization. People hear the term, see that no one challenges it, and begin to act as though it were accurate enough. Its second principle is restraint. Not because the distortion is minor, but because the person using it often lacks the appetite or capacity to metabolize a full corrective. To give a beautiful 5-paragraph defense of structure to someone operating at low conceptual resolution is usually to spend gold into mud. The truth deserves better stewardship than that. Restraint, in this sense, is not weakness. It is conservation. One says what protects reality. One refuses what must be refused. One declines the invitation to perform one's entire mind for an audience that has not earned access to it. Its third principle is the refusal of deference to inaccurate premises. There is a politeness that is really surrender. It bends around power, even when power is wrong. It thanks the reductive stakeholder for the question. It gently accommodates the stale category. It hopes humility will buy safety. Often it buys only more reduction. The correction can be courteous, but it cannot be yielding. There is a difference between civility and acquiescence. Civility preserves human dignity. Acquiescence surrenders conceptual ground. The art lies in keeping the first while rejecting the second. Its fourth principle is emotional economy. The most important thing about certain stakeholders is not what they understand, but how expensive they are to one's nervous system. Some men are noisy, reductive, entitled to simplification, and fortified by titles they did not earn in the domain under discussion. They can destabilize disproportionately if one allows each interaction to become a symbolic war over reality itself. The task is therefore not merely communicative, but metabolic. Reduce how much of your body they are permitted to occupy. This is perhaps the hardest principle of all, to preserve truth while refusing to hand over internal sovereignty, to feel the insult, the stale public reset, the narrowing, and still not let it colonize an entire weekend. To recognize that the person is a force in the organization, but not the axis of one's existence. Calm non-acquiescence says, I will not flatter your distortion, but neither will I make you my God. Its fifth principle is repetition. One brief correction rarely changes a pattern. The pattern changes when the person becomes known for quietly but consistently refusing false categories. Over time, others learn. Not all, not perfectly, but enough. The organization begins to sense that certain framings will not pass unchallenged. Reality gains a little institutional muscle. This mode will not solve everything. Some sponsors will remain incomplete. Some executives will remain reductive. Some patterns of diminishment will outlast one's efforts. Calm non-acquiescence is not a fantasy of total control. It is a style of self-respect under imperfect conditions. It is also formative. When you repeatedly refuse false frames with disciplined brevity, you stop needing every room to validate your scale. The act of correction itself becomes a form of inner consolidation. You hear yourself name the truth enough times that you become less tempted to doubt it when others lag behind. In the end, that may be its deepest gift. Not that it defeats every distortion, but that it keeps the person from being inwardly converted into the institution's compressed version of him. He remains proportionate to his burden. He remains unwilling to purchase smooth interactions at the cost of false speech. In a world that increasingly rewards the opposite, that itself is a form of authority. 10. The name must be claimed. There are times when the world will not hand you the right name in time. It may eventually. Sometimes sponsorship matures. Sometimes the operating model clarifies. Sometimes repeated witness accumulates, and the organization slowly updates its understanding of where leadership actually sits. But there are seasons when the person carrying the burden cannot wait for that process to complete before he lives at the scale already demanded of him. In such seasons, the name must be claimed. This does not mean self-inflation. It does not mean theatrical self-branding, constant territorial assertion, or the pathetic modern habit of confusing visibility with vocation. It means something plainer and harder: to speak accurately about what one owns, what one leads, and what one is carrying, without apology and without waiting for every higher status actor to make it socially comfortable first. If the institution keeps narrowing the role, the person must widen the speech. If the room keeps speaking to one fragment, he must calmly narrate the whole. If others keep treating him as though he were a function inside the machine, he must keep naming the fact that he is one of the places where the machine is actually being integrated. This is not vanity, it is stewardship. Silence is not neutral in institutions. It is an open field into which smaller stories enter and harden. Work does not speak for itself. Other people speak for the work. And if the person closest to the substance is unwilling to narrate that substance at the right level of scale, the story will be written by those with more ambient power and less intimate contact with reality. To claim the name is therefore not an act of self-decoration. It is an act of proportion. One says, "This is not simply a model. Its current center of gravity includes execution, program design, and system sequencing." One says, "This role is not downstream technical support. It owns technical direction, integration, prioritization, and the conditions of delivery." One says what is true, repeatedly enough, that others must either update or reveal themselves as committed to distortion. The claiming of the name also marks an inner break from dependency on misaligned mirrors. As long as a person waits to feel real only when the institution reflects him accurately, he remains hostage to the lag, laziness, and politics of other people's language. This is too fragile a foundation for serious work. One must come to know one's scale through burden itself, through what the role has required, through the contradictions one has already had to hold, through the repeated social fact that others bring complexity to you because at some level they know where integration lives, even when they do not speak of it well. There is peace in this recognition. Not easy peace, but firmer ground. The institution's failure to name you fully does not erase the truth of what you are already doing. It creates risk, it creates burden, it creates distortion, but it does not create ontology. The role exists before the room catches up to it, and yet inner knowledge is not enough. One cannot retreat into private certainty and call it maturity. Private certainty without public narration becomes martyrdom by another name. The person then knows the truth about his role, but allows the social field to continue operating on a smaller fiction. No, the claiming must be both inward and outward. The self must stop doubting its scale, and the organization must be repeatedly invited, and if necessary, quietly forced, to encounter that scale in speech, routing, and operating reality. Everything in this essay points here. The work had no name, because others preferred it smaller. The smaller frame was a violence because it redistributed gravity. He was used in full and seen in part because institutions consume breadth while narrating fragments. Sponsorship without witness left the role trusted but unstable. The translator carried too much because the system lacked honest interfaces. The empire of shorthand supplied the broader logic. The split between power and permission explained the humiliation of being responsible without fully ratified authorship. Calm, non-acquiescence offered the proper style of refusal. What remains is the final act, not aggression, not pleading, not despair, but naming. The name they would not give him must be spoken anyway. Not because speech alone solves the politics. It does not. Not because one sentence can reverse chronic diminishment. It cannot. But because silence leaves the field to flatterers, reducers, and men who think stale handles are reality, because unnamed leadership invites drift, because one cannot spend a life carrying the whole while speaking of oneself in pieces. The deepest injury in such situations is not that others fail to praise. It is that they ask a person to inhabit a reduced public description of his own labor. The deepest recovery is not praise either. It is proportion. To stand again in the full dimensions of what one actually carries. To let speech match burden. To let ownership become sayable. To stop confusing partial witness with final truth. A mature institution would make this easier. Many do not. So the person must practice a harder fidelity. He must tell the truth about the work, the role, and the operating model until the social air around him changes or reveals itself incapable of changing. Either outcome is useful. Better a painful truth than a comfortable diminishment. In the end, every serious life encounters some version of this decision. Will I live by the smaller name because it is easier for others? Or will I calmly inhabit the fuller one because it is truer to what I have actually been asked to carry? There is only one answer worthy of a free mind. The name must be claimed. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.